It has long been believed that ships have been going missing in the Bermuda Triangle due to alien activity, the devil, or even from something to do with the lost city of Atlantis. But conspiracy theories aside, what is really going on? Well, one more plausible explanation is that the sinking of ships in this area is tied to large expulsions of bubbles from gases under the ocean floor, in particular, methane bubbles from reserves in the seabed. There has been evidence for this theory both in the lab and from the discovery of gas craters in Norway, from which parallels can be drawn. Okay, but why would sudden releases of gas bubbles cause a ship to sink? This brings us to the next myth.
Take a look at this video. In it, he adds bubbles into normal water in a small tank and shows a small object that initially sinks but then starts bobbing up and down. And as you can see, the points at which the object sinks is when it reaches the barriers of the container, at the edge of the bubble field. Interesting. What's going on here? The myth that coincides with what we mentioned earlier is that carbonated water causes things to sink because adding gas to water lowers the water's average density. Some even say it is impossible for a person to swim in bubbly water or for a boat to float in it.
Why is this myth believed? As we know, gases are less dense than water. We also know that the reason certain objects can float in water is because their average densities are lower than the density of water. The material of a boat is spread out over a large area, thus increasing the buoyant force acting on it because it displaces more water. So, this myth is believed to be true by so many because when you think about it, it does initially make a lot of logical sense. When you put a fluid of lower density into a fluid of higher density, the average density of that higher density fluid will decrease.
Now, by how much, we don't know. And is this enough to lower the density so much so that a human or a boat becomes more dense than it? Well, it depends on the gas in question and the volume of gas bubbles that are present. In addition, there is more to this theory. There are more factors to consider than just the densities.
It is true that adding gas to water lowers the average density of that region of water, which in theory should cause the floating object to sink. But because there's a current created by the gas bubbles, this actually creates an upward force on the object in the water, pushing it upwards as well. When the bubbles come up from underneath the floating object, they drag liquid up with them. The liquid is entrained by the rising bubbles, which has momentum and pushes the object upwards.
Momentum is also created by the fact that the bubbly water does indeed have a lower average density, so the surrounding water, with a higher density, gets sucked in underneath, creating a sort of vicious cycle. The magnitude of upward force that the turbulence from the bubbles produces on the floating body also increases with increasing airflow rate. So essentially, these two effects cancel each other out, and therefore the floating object stays floating.
That is, until the object reaches the cusp between the bubbly water and regular water. As this regular water is being sucked down, any object here could also get sucked down if it was not weighted properly, and in the case of a boat, if it turned sideways so that the long side was parallel with this edge. Most modern boats have airtight protection and other stabilizing mechanisms to keep them afloat, but an older boat could have sank like this. Thus, this theory likely doesn't really account for any oddities of the Bermuda Triangle today, but it is pretty interesting, and so is the physics behind it.
In many experiments testing this myth, the way they set it up allowed for the floating body to move outside of the bubble region before it had the opportunity to demonstrate if it would sink due to the lower density caused by the bubbles, thus deeming their findings inconclusive. Theoretically, in an environment that is entirely closed and not affected by airflow, it is possible that the lower density bubbles would cause a floating body to sink, as the upward drag caused by their turbulence would be negligible, as no cycling of water would be occurring. But this has no real-world applications, as all environments where you would find a boat floating or a person swimming are open.
There have been actual attempts to test this myth out, one being the buoyancy bomb. This is when an underwater vehicle, like a submarine, goes deep underwater and digs up a methane deposit in an attempt to sink the floating target. However, this type of experiment has never had any report of being successful in sinking any floating body. So, For all we know, maybe the mysterious boat sinkings and disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle have actually been caused by aliens.